بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم فقد نوينا تعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى ودلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, in our looks at the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala wa nafa'ana bihi, we have entered into the Book of Zakat. Last week we discussed some of the introductory issues of the zakat. One, it became obligatory, the fact that it's not obligatory on the prophets. I believe we mentioned some of what its linguistic meaning entails, which we'll revisit today as a small recap. Right, so the word zakat in Arabic has essentially three sub-meanings in it, and all three of those sub-meanings, linguistic meanings, have a particular manifestation in the legal meaning of zakat as well. Right, so the word zakat, it means one, purity. Right, so this is where you have the idea of tazkiyah to nafs, the purification of the self. It comes from the word zakah, right? And we see that one of the roles of the prophets, of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, is رَبَّنَا وَابْعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ. Right? O my Lord, send amongst them a messenger from them who will teach them, who will read upon them your verses and teach them the wisdom and purify them. Yuzakkihim is the same word as zakat, as zakat. Right, so to purify something, it also means to grow, right, which is a numu. Right? So you would say that zakat shay'u idha nama, that something grew, you would say zakat. Right, so it has the word growth, and we'll see that growth is also applies to the legal meaning. And then praise. Right, Allah says, فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِينَ يُزَكُّونَ أَنفُسَهُمْ. فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. And do not praise yourselves. He knows best who has the taqwa, who has the most taqwa. Right, so it has all three of these. Right, so linguistically, legally, zakat is a purification of your wealth. Right, it allows, it's due on wealth that grows, but it also helps you grow your wealth. Right, in the sense of barakah, not in the sense of quantity. Right, in the quality of your wealth, but not the quantity. Right, so barakah is khayrun ilahiyun muthbatun fi shay'. Is the placement of a divine good in something. Right, so that's barakah. Right, so barakah, right, is the word that the Arabs would use when a camel would lay down, because even a skinny camel, if it laid down, the stomach would be pressed against the ground, and it would look fatter than it really is. Right, so that's what they would call barakah. If somebody had, for instance, enough food for two people, but all five of the guests ate till their fill, they would say that's barakah. Right? So it's like the camel who laid down and looks bigger than it actually is. Right? So, right, and this is why, just a side note, right, if you say mabruk, right, it's not the proper term. It's mubarak is the proper term, even though mabruk is common. But mabruk actually means the camel who's laying down. Right? So you don't want to praise somebody by calling them camels. And we'll be talking about camels today, so that's why we're bringing that joke. Right, so the legal meaning, on the other hand, right, shar'an, what do we mean when we talk about, right, zakat as the worship, not just the word? Right, so zakat, it has a multifaceted definition, and the purpose of the definition is what? Right, to make a proper definition, there are some rules. There's actually rules to definitions. Right, this is the science of nomenclature. Right, the rules of making a proper definition. So one of the rules is that you do not place in the definition any rulings that relate to the thing. Right. The second, you do not place in the definition anything except that which is specific to the thing, and you do not place in the definition anything that is extra. Right. So it comprises of everything that thing is, and it has nothing of what that thing is not. Right. So because of such strict, right, and the scholars are very critical of good definitions, right? Very critical of good definitions. You'll see in the higher books, when they, like the commentaries, for instance, of the different works, they'll say that he should use this word instead of this word in the definition. Why? Because there's rules. There's rules to the definition. Right, so when we're talking about zakat, right, some scholars took the broader approach, and they said that it's the transference of ownership of a specific type of wealth to a specific type of person. Right? And by using generalities and not using specifics, you kind of save yourself half the stress of making a good definition. One of the best definitions that I've come across is the definition of Sahib al-Bahr, Ibn Nujaym, where he says it's the transference of ownership, right? So tamlik, right? And each of these words is important because they all have to do with the rulings of zakat. So you're transferring ownership, right? Right. So you can't let somebody borrow something and consider that your zakat. Why? Because borrowing is not ownership. Correct? All right. And this is why feeding people as part of your zakat is problematic. Because is that ownership? If I give you a burger, you come to my house and I say, here's a burger. Right? Do you own the burger? What do you think? Do you own the burger or not? It's tough. It's the gray area. Technically you don't. You're permitted to eat the burger. You're permitted to eat whatever I serve, but you can't take it home with you. You can't just fill up your go bag and then take it all with you for seconds. Right? So it's transference of ownership of a specific portion of wealth. Right? So it's not all of your wealth. It's 2.5% of the wealth with regards to gold and silver, and we'll talk about the different types. All right. A specific portion of wealth to a poor Muslim, right? So poor meaning not a person who owns their own nisab, right? Not a person who's considered rich. Now Islam has very specific criteria of poverty and affluence, right? So you have to be on this side of that standard to receive zakat. So poor Muslim who is not Hashimi, so they're not from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, they're not from the Hashemites, which includes 5 families. Right? So, or of the Hashimi slaves, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said that a person who is a freed slave of a people is amongst them. Right? So say I have for instance, the Weltch tribe. Right? We're the Welches. The Weltch tribe, and we have a slave. If I free the slave, that slave has an affiliation to the Welch tribe, so they're amongst the Welches. Right? So anyone, you can't give the zakat to the Hashimis, right? Because the family of the Prophet. And we'll talk about some modern issues with regards to that, especially Ahl al-Bayt, the prophetic family. Nor can you give zakats to anyone who is from the freed slaves of the Hashemites, right? Because they are considered amongst them. Right? So like Zayd, who is mentioned in the Quran, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, right? Right? And that transference of ownership must be such that all benefit is severed from the giver of the zakat. Right? So there's no benefit returning to me, right, from that same money. Right? Now, what is what is excluded by adding this condition to the definition? One thing that is excluded is that you can't give your zakat to someone who you are considered to be their guardian, right, and such that their wealth is your wealth. So you're pretty much giving it to yourself. So you can't give your zakat to your own slave because you own everything the slave owns. Right? Therefore, the ties of that benefit of that money does never cut off from you. Right? And this is where one of the issues that comes from this is the issue of giving it to your spouse. Because even though the spouses, they necessarily, right, for instance, the wife has her own money. Right? It's not, if they decide to mix it, that's their own choice, but they don't have to. She has her own money. So if I give a zakat to my wife, right, there is still benefit that comes back, because if my wife is wealthy, then I benefit. Right? So some of the rulings that have to come from that condition in the definition. So this is a decent, it's a quite good definition. Right, so there's a lot of things that are excluded by using these specific definitions. One, right, a transference of ownership. Right, it can't be. So anything that is considered a transfer of ownership is permissible to do as a giving of your zakat. Like, for instance, giving a gift. Right? If you give somebody a gift, you've transferred ownership to them, right, without the exchange of any price or cost. Right? So it's not a sale. Right? You're transferring ownership. Right? So I could go to somebody and say, here's a gift. Right? And my intention is that it's zakat, and that's sufficient. Right? So you don't have to tell the person that it's zakat. Right? Why? Because this is part of the definition. It's a transference of ownership. That's what it means. All right, specific portion of wealth, and we'll be talking about that today. Like what wealth must you pay zakat on, and how much of that wealth must you pay zakat? Right? And then on furthermore is what is wealth? Right? What is wealth specifically? Right. So let's jump into the rulings. So Imam al-Quduri, alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, he says, "Az-zakatu wajibatun." Zakat is wajib. Wajib meaning fard. And wajib and fard are used interchangeably. They're used interchangeably. And you'll see that even in other madhab, they don't have the distinguishment between fard and wajib, like the Shafi'i madhab, except for Hajj. They do differentiate between the arkan, the integrals, which are fard, and other aspects of Hajj. But the words are interchangeable because wajabat, thabatat. Right? It's wajib, meaning fard. Right? But the Imam, he says, عَلَى الْحُرِّ الْمُسْلِمِ الْبَالِغِ الْعَاقِلِ إِذَا مَلَكَ نِصَابًا مِلْكًا تَامًّا وَحَالَ عَلَيْهِ الْحَوْلِ. He mentions that it's obligatory upon, and then he gives a list of criteria. So these are called shurut al-wujub, the conditions of obligation. What does that mean? Meaning that if you fulfill these conditions, it is wajib upon you. If you don't fulfill these conditions, it is not wajib upon you to give zakat. Okay, so first we say it is obligatory on the free person, so it's not obligatory on the slave. Partially because the definition doesn't apply to the slave, right? Because you can't transfer the ownership of something you don't own yourself. Okay? And the slave, لا يقدر على شيء, he doesn't own anything. Now, one thing that could come to one's mind is, what about the mukatab slave? Right? The mukatab is the contracted, right? It's more like an indentured servant. It's a contract, a slave who's working on a contract that they could buy their freedom after a while. So they're earning wealth and they're keeping it. They're earning wealth and they're keeping it. And in the end, their goal is to take that wealth and pay, right, for their freedom. So not all of their money is going to the master. Right? So, but the condition here that Imam al-Quduri mentions later is that it must be a complete ownership. You must have complete ownership of that wealth, which the mukatab does not have. Right? Likewise, if you have a partnership, if you're business partners with somebody, right, and your business has reaches the threshold of amount of zakat, right, but 50% of it's yours and 50% of it's his, right? If you were to separate them, each of you is halfway to the zakat amount, right? Neither of you has to pay because you don't have complete ownership of 100% of that wealth. Right? It's shared wealth. So you have to have, so a person must be free, they must be Muslim. So the non-Muslim is not obliged to pay the zakat. A non-Muslim in the Muslim, under Muslim governance in the past was called a dhimmi. A dhimmi comes from the word dhimma, which means that they're under the Muslim responsibility. Generally, the dhimmi would pay a different type of tax instead of the zakat, which is less than the zakat, right, and is used specifically for their own benefits. It's not used for the Muslims. It's put back directly for them, for their benefit and for their needs, municipalities and such. Right? So you have the jizya, right? The jizya. Right? So the Muslim adults, so the child doesn't have to pay zakat. Right? Some scholars, they said that because zakat is an obligation on the wealth, not necessarily the person, that if a child has a lot of money, then the child has to pay zakat. But most of the texts exclude the child from obligation. Because children are not mukallaf, they're not adults, so they're not responsible for sharia. The sane person, right, with exclusion of the zakat of the land zakat, if a child owns land, then the zakat of the land is due. Not because of the child, regardless of the owner, it's because of the land. The obligation is specific to the land. They must be sane, right? And whenever we have sane, the aqil, right, what's excluded by that is the majnoon, which is the person who's lost sanity, right? And then there's an in-between level called the ma'tu. The ma'tu is the person who is, right, has a deficient intellect or a deficient level of sanity, but they're not fully, right, insane. So here you may have like levels of autism, and the very severe autism would be closer to the majnoon category. They will not be obliged to for these legal injunctions. But slight autism, right, is not necessarily an exclusion, but it's a case-to-case basis. And some people are different according to different times. You have one person, right, at one moment they may be very alert and very attentive and very vocal and responsive, and later in that day they're not. Right? They're back and forth. Right, so there's different rulings regarding to that. Then he says malaka nisaban, and the condition that they own the nisab. Now the nisab is the threshold of wealth that distinguishes between poverty and affluence. So if you have what's considered the nisab, the zakatable threshold, or the minimum zakatable amount, right, then you're considered ghani, you're considered rich. Right, so if you have nisab, you can't accept zakat because you're not a poor person, right? And if you have nisab, then you would have to pay zakat if you fulfill the other conditions. Okay, you own the nisab, and that ownership is complete. It's a complete ownership, so it's not yours to use, but you don't actually own it. Right? Like for instance, you're leasing something, that's not ownership. You're renting something, that's not ownership. Right? Even if you're put in care of something, right, it's not ownership. Right? So somebody made you their agent to give out their zakat, and you have this amount of money in your hand, that's not yours. Right? So that's not ownership. You are just an agent for someone else who owns it. So you have the rights to deal in it, but it's not yours. So they differentiate between al-yad, actual ownership, and then just being able, the right to deal with it, to deal in that thing. So you have to have actual ownership, which is complete. And then, right, once you have that, right, your lunar year starts. Your lunar year starts. So you start calculating from that time. Right? Once one lunar year passes, then it's obligatory to give the zakat. Right? So the lunar year passing is a condition of obligation. Right? And what is the wisdom of the whole year having to pass? One of the wisdoms is some businesses, like if you have a business, for instance, or if you're in agriculture, you're a farmer, then certain seasons are good for you and some are bad. Winter, as a farmer, is not, you prepare for it ahead of time. Right? So by having the whole year having to pass by, then everybody gets a fair chance at all 4 seasons. Everybody has a fair chance at all 4 seasons. Right? So if you make all your money in summer and spring and not in winter and fall, then you make it in summer and spring, and then if it lasts through the winter and fall, then you pay. Right? Whereas other people may make their money in winter. Right? So those are the conditions of obligation. So what is excluded is the child, the person who is not sane, right? The slave, even if it's the contracted slave, right? Because, right? So لَيْسَ عَلَى صَبِيٍّ وَلَا مَجْنُونٍ وَلَا مُكَتِّبٍ zakat. Right? Because they don't fulfill these conditions. After that, he talks about debts. Right? وَمَنْ كَانَ عَلَيْهِ دَيْنٌ يُحِيطُ بِمَالِهِ فَلَا زَكَاةَ عَلَيْهِ. Whoever has debt that encompasses all of their wealth, then there's no zakat due on that person. Right, so say you fulfill all the conditions before. You have the minimum zakatable amount, the nisab, right? But you have debts. So say you have, for instance, $10,000. Say, let's just throw a number out there. Say the nisab is $4,000 Canadian, right? And you have 10,000, right? So you have the nisab and more, okay? But you owe $10,000 in debts, right? So the debt is subtracted from the wealth. You have 0 left. You don't have to pay zakat because you haven't reached the nisab, okay? However, if there is more wealth, if the debt is subtracted and there's more wealth that remains, if that wealth equals the nisab, then you pay on that. So if the nisab is 5,000 and you have 15,000, okay, but you owe 10,000, how much do you have left after you subtract the debt? 5,000. Good, right? And 5,000 is the nisab, right? So your year has started, right? And once the year is finished, you pay on the 5,000. Okay, so you subtract the debt. Now this also applies to future debts. Right? Now most of the debts that people find themselves in are called ad-dayn al-mu'ajjal, that they are delayed payment debts. Delayed payment debts. Right? So for instance, a person has rent to pay at the end of the month. Right? So at the moment right now, they're technically not in debt, but there is a perceivable debt that's coming. Right? So the scholars agree that you can subtract debts of the future up to 1 month. And that's agreed upon. Right? So if you have a debt within the month coming up, you can subtract that. You don't have to pay. Right? You can subtract that from the money that you owe. Now, there is another opinion that you can subtract up to a year. Up to a year. And there's a general recommendation to use the ruling of the month unless there is a specific necessity that's coming in the year. Like for instance, your daughter is going to college, right, at the end of the year, and there's a large amount of money that you have to pay, right, for her entrance fee, for instance, right? So if you see that as a foreseeable debt coming up at the end of the year, you can subtract that from your wealth now, right? Because it's a one-off thing which is really big, and it may be detrimental to you if you were to not. But the more cautious thing would be to not subtract it unless you really need to, right? If you have more than enough money to pay for her college and to pay your zakat, then the idea is you want to pay the zakat, right? It's not a tax, right? It's not a fine. The zakat is not a fine. It's a worship. It's an act of worship, right? And you should want to pay the zakat, right? And it's not a lot of money. It's 2.5%. Right? So if you had $1, if you had $10, you'd pay $2.50. You'd pay more than that in your normal sales tax. Right? So debts are subtracted from zakat calculations. Right? Anything that remains left is still potentially zakatable if it reaches the nisab. Right? And also personal necessities are excluded. Right? Amongst personal necessities, you can consider debts as personal necessities. Right? So your upcoming rent, your upcoming phone bill, right? Those are necessities. Now, personal necessities, Imam Quduri, he mentions specifically, he says, وَلَيْسَ فِي الدُّورِ السُّكْنَى وَثِيَابِ الْبَدَنِ وَأَثَاثِ الْمَنْزِلِ وَدَوَابِ الرُّكُوبِ وَعَبِيدِ الْخِدْمَةِ وَسِلَاحِ الْإِسْتِعْمَالِ zakat. Right? There is no zakat due in houses of residence, homes of residence. Why homes of residence? Meaning, if you sell homes, if you own a house to sell and you have it on the market, then that's considered merchandise. That's a whole different topic, right? Thiyab al-badan, right? Your clothing, your own personal clothing, right? And that applies to, right, keeping the seasons in mind. So if you have clothes stored up for the winter, that's a personal necessity. Right? And there's a general encouragement not to amass wealth that you're not using, right? So you have, right, boxes and boxes of clothes that you haven't used in years. Give it in charity. Right? There's no need to hoard all of that, right? But if you have something that you use in the summer and then a jacket that you use in the winter, right, those are all necessities. The furniture of your home are necessities. Your riding beast, right? In this time, your car is a necessity, right? وَعَبِيدٍ khidma, your servants, right? Or you can consider your employees, right? As a necessity. Silah al-isti'mal, your tools, your work tools are a necessity. So if you use a computer for work, or if you're a contractor and you have to have, right, the whole new set of DeWalt's, right, saws, and that's for your job, then you can subtract that. And that is not, you don't add that to the wealth that you have, right? For multiple reasons. One, they're not zakatable anyway, right? Because they're not growing wealth. They're not considered growing wealth, right? Even though they are a possession. If you tried to sell them, then that would be merchandise. But at the same time, they are necessities, right? So the money that you need to buy those things in the future is also, right, is also considered as if it's not there. Likewise, they also mention books for the scholars, right? For the scholars to have to have a library of books, even multiple books, multiple of the same book but different copies. Right? That's fine. Those are necessities, right? Or any type of thing that you need for your trade. Right, so, and we see a lot in this time that you could have a house, you can have a computer and a phone and everything, but you don't have much money. Right? You don't have much liquid wealth. You could accept zakat. Right? The fact that you have a house does not mean that you're faqir, right? If the house is for your necessity. If you have extra houses, then that's a problem. Right? That may disqualify you from accepting zakat. Tamam. Then he goes on to the conditions of giving the zakat, right? The conditions of giving the zakat, right? What's this? Shurut al-ada, the conditions of performance, meaning that if you fulfill the conditions, then your performance is valid. The performance is valid. They're also called shurut al-sihha, right? The conditions of validity. I believe I made a mistake on the text here. It's the next text, right? It says بِنِيَّةٍ مُقَارْنَةٍ لِلْأَدَاءِ, right? That it is not permissible to give your charity except with an intention that is directly tied in with the performance, meaning the giving of the zakat, right? So zakat is an act of worship, and every act of worship needs an intention. Every act of worship needs an intention for it to be valid if that act of worship is sought in and of itself, right? Ibadah maqsuda, right? So that excludes like wudu, for instance. It's an act of worship, but it's for something else. It's not intrinsically something sought by itself. So the intention has to either be at the moment of paying. So I'm giving this to the poor person and I'm intending zakat. And intention is in the heart. I don't have to tell them that it's zakat. Because they may accept a gift, but they may not want to accept charity. Okay? People have a dignity that they may not want that. So you tell them it's a gift. It's a gift. Right? So it can be at the moment of giving, which is the ideal situation, because that's exactly when the action is being done. It's like saying Allahu Akbar at the moment and intending exactly when you say Allahu Akbar for your prayer. However, because of the necessity, so say a person owes $5,000 in zakat. So 5,000 is 2.5% of whatever amount that they have. It's quite a lot, actually. And they might not give all 5,000 at one shot. So they may give a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. And for them to have an intention every single time, right, they may miss out on a certain time. They may forget to intend. And they may just distribute and not realize that it was the zakat that they meant. So if you separate that 5,000 from your initial wealth and say that, okay, this 5,000 is for zakat, and you intended it at that moment, right, that is sufficient. Even if when you distribute it to individuals, you don't make an additional intention. Right, so that's sufficient. Right, and that's because of necessity. Otherwise, it would be very difficult. Likewise, if you have an agent, right, so you're giving your zakat to someone to distribute it for you. Right, so say, for instance, you know you have to pay zakat, but you don't know all the specifics. Is this guy a poor person? Is this guy from the family of the Prophet? Is this guy, right, is this person eligible or not? Right, so you give it to one of the local scholars, and they know who's who. Right? So when you give it to them, you intend, that's sufficient. Right? As they distribute, their intention is not required. Right? You intended when you separated it by giving it to them, that's sufficient. Now, there's one extra issue, which is for the sake of haraj, right? Because of the undue difficulty involved. Say, for instance, you owe $200 in zakat, right? And you pass by Brother Zaid. You know Brother Zaid, he's seeking knowledge, so he hasn't been working, he's kind of hard off, but he's content. Right? He has enough food for the day, and that's enough for him, and he's got his books. Right, so you're like, Brother Zaid, he could use some zakat. He's definitely eligible. So you give him the 200, and then you realize, oh wait, I didn't even intend anything. I just gave him $200, right? Right. So I gave zakat without intention. Technically, it doesn't count. But if I intend that money that's in Zaid's hand is for zakat before he spends it, right, then it's sufficient. It counts. It counts as an intention, because it would be difficult, because then you would have to pay another 200. Right? You essentially gave 200 in regular charity, and your obligation of the zakat is still on you otherwise. Right? But no, as long as it's in the possession of the poor person and you intend it, it counts. Another issue that is based on this idea of undue difficulty is, what if, right, one day you go to Seeker's Guidance, mashallah, and you hear a talk. Shaykh Faraz was encouraging people to give charity. And then you said, you know what? I give all my wealth, right, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you gave all of your wealth in charity. Right? Even though zakat was already due on you. Your lunar year finished yesterday. So you're supposed to give zakat. Right? But you gave all your wealth in just regular charity, sadaqah. Right? So now you have no wealth. You have zero. Right? The obligation of paying the zakat falls off. The obligation of paying the zakat falls off. If you give all of your wealth is gone. Same thing happens if all of your wealth is destroyed. Right? May Allah not allow this to happen, but say a person is, they want to move to the States from England, and they get aboard this really new and progressive boat called the Titanic, right? And they bring all their wealth with them, right? And then, alhamdulillah, they survived, but they lost everything. So zakat is not due on that wealth because it's not there anymore. Right? So those are some opening issues that he talks about before he goes into the idea of the nusub, the nisab, the minimum zakatable amounts. The minimum zakatable amounts. First, he talks about animals, and generally, even though it's wrong to say that it's not practical to talk about zakat of animals because people don't have animals. Yeah, people don't have animals maybe where you are. I know I've been to many places where people have lots of animals. Right? So these rulings, even though they may not be relevant to you, right, they are relevant. And anyone who is seeking knowledge to be of the people of talabul ilm, then you are the people who this is relevant to come to. Right? So they're going to come to you for answers, and so these are important to know, right? At least to a basic extent, right? And then you know where to reference the rulings themselves if specifics come. Right, so we're going to talk about the basics of animals. So there's zakat of camels, zakat of sheep, and zakat of cows. Right? Then they talk about zakat of horses, which is a difference of opinion in it. Now, all of the animals, there's a prerequisite condition. One, that the animals must be free grazing for majority of the year, right? With regards to the camels, cows, and sheep, because these are cattle, right? They're sa'ima, right? They must be free grazing for majority of the year. And what does free grazing mean? They're not being fed by you and by your money. You're not paying for them to be fed. So you're not giving them fodder or whatever they eat, right, from your own money. You're letting them graze in the fields. So free grazing for majority of the year, right? And these are all conditions, right? So if majority of the year you are paying for them to be fed, you don't have to pay zakat on them, right? Because you're already spending on them. Then you'd have to spend for them again. That would be difficult. Okay, so that's one. Right? And the reason why it's majority of the year, because some months of the year you may have to feed them. Right? So say, for instance, you can let your cows graze in the summer, the spring, and the fall. But winter you have to keep them inside, and you have to feed them from your own money. So that's only 3 months out of the year. Right? Majority of the time they free graze. The second is that the intention of your having those cattle is not for work. Right? They're not for work, because that would be a personal necessity. Right? So if you use them to till the fields and to do all the other things, then that is work. Likewise, if you use them to eat, like if you have goats for eating, then that's excluded. If you have them for instance, breeding, or to sell later on, or right, to grow so that to become more valuable, right, then that's what zakat is due on, because it's growing wealth, either literally or metaphorically. If they're for sale, if you're selling sheep or camels or goats, right, then that's a whole different subject. That's merchandise. Right, we'll talk about that later. Right, likewise, if you use them to ride, like if your camel is for your riding, right, then you don't have to pay on it as well. Like as we just mentioned, وَالدَّوَابِ الرُّكُوبِ, right, and the animals for riding. So we'll go through the minimum zakatable amounts, the nisab, the threshold for each of them quickly. And we'll try to add some relevant issues. Right, so the minimum amounts of camels that you'd have to have in order to give charity is 5. Right, so the Imam says, لَيْسَ فِي أَقَلَّ مِنْ خَمْسٍ مِنْ ذَوْدٍ مِنَ الْإِبِلِ صَدَقَةً. Right, less than 5 dhawd of camels, there is no zakat in less than 5. Now, a dhawd is between the ages of 3 to 10. Right, so if you have camels that are younger than that, zakat is not due. Right, so the ages of the camels are very relevant as well. Right, so so at least 5 camels who are 3 to 10 years old, between 3 and 10 years old, they're called a dhawd. If you have 5 up to 9, then you give 1 goat. You can give the goat itself, or you can give the equivalent value of a goat. And we'll talk about later that the one who takes the zakat does not take the best quality, nor do they take the worst. Right? Because by taking the best of your wealth, so the best goat that you have, or the best whatever that you have, is a hardship on the owner, right? And taking the worst is a hardship on the poor. So they take the moderate amounts, right? And then 10 to 14, you give 2 goats, right? 15 to 19, 3 goats. 20 to 24, 4 goats. 25 to 35, you give 1 bintu makhad, which is you give a camel that has entered into its 2nd year. Bintu makhad literally means the daughter of pregnancy. It means it's the age when a camel is able to have children themselves. When a young camel is able to give birth, right? So that's 3 years old. A 3-year-old camel is able to have children, so it's called bint makhad. Makhad being, it's actually the pains of pregnancy. Right? فَأَجَاءَهَا الْمَخَاضُ إِلَى جِذْعِ النَّخْلِ. Allah talks about Maryam. Right? فَأَجَاءَهَا الْمَخَاض. The pains of pregnancy drove her to the tree. Sorry, there's a small mistake there. The bint makhad is the camel who is entered into their 2nd year. They're called that because majority of the time the mother of that camel is pregnant again. Not the camel itself. The mother of the camel is pregnant again with a 2nd. Right. Prior to being bint makhad, it's called a fasil. A fasil. Fasil is the one who doesn't separate from the mother. They're still walking alongside the mother or the father, or I believe the mother. Then 36 to 45 is bint al-labun. Labun means milk, right? So it's 3 years old. The mother at that time is usually nursing the next child. Right, so they're the daughter of a nursing mother, bint labun. Right, then 46 to 60, you give a hiqqah. So you have 60 camels, you give 1 hiqqah. A hiqqah is a 4-year-old camel. It's called that because at that time, yastahiqqu al-hamal wal-rukub. It's able to carry a load on its back, and it's able to take riders. So from 4 years old, you can ride a camel. Before that, don't try it. right? Right, then 61 to 75, a jada'ah. Jada'ah is, it has to do with something about the camel's teeth, because the ages of the camels are differentiated and known by their ages by their teeth. Right, so jada'ah, something happens to their teeth at that age. It's a 5-year-old camel. So, and then the people who have knowledge of camels, they can tell, right, because of something in their teeth. Right, 76 to 90 is 2 bint laboon, right? And then 91 to 120 is 2 hiqqah. Right? And then the Imam says, ثُمَّ تُسْتَأْنَفُ الْفَرِيضَةُ فَيَكُونُ فِي الْخَمْسِ شَاةٌ مَعَ الْحِقَّتَيْنِ. Then everything repeats, right, after that. Right? So every additional 5, right, there will be 1 additional goat. So you give 2 hiqqah and a goat. Right? Then 2 hiqqah and 2 goats. Then 2 hiqqah and 3 goats, and then so on. So it continues then. The next is the cows. Right, so we're going to try to move a bit fast on these. No offense to the cows. Right, so the minimum amount of cows that you'd have to give zakat is 30. 30 baqarah. Now the baqarah, usually there are two types of baqarah that are mentioned here, is the tabi' and the musin. Tabi' comes from the word tabi'ah, which means to follow, and musin comes from the word sin, which means teeth. Right, so the tabi' is a 2-year-old camel, 2-year-old cow. It's known by that because it follows its mother around. It's still following its mother around at 2 years old. And the musin is a 3-year-old camel, right, and right, having to do with the teeth, obviously. So if you have 30 cows, 30 to 39, you give a tabi', a 2-year-old. If you have 40 to 60, you give a musin. Now, in more than 60, right, it goes like this. Right? Every 30, whenever you get to a multiple of 30, right, you give a tabi'. Whenever you get to a multiple of 40, you give a musin. Right? And that's how you do it. Right? So if you have, for instance, 80, you owe 80. You have 80 cows, right? You give 2 musin, because the musin is worth 40. Right? You give 2 musin. Right? If you have 70 cows, you give a musin and a tabi'. Okay? If you have 100, right? And then sometimes you have choices. Like for instance, when the multiples overlap. So if you have, for instance, what would be a good example of that? 120. If you have 120, right, you can give either 40, 40, 40, 3 musin, right? Correct? Or you can give 30, 60, 90, 120, or 4 tabi', or a mixture of the two. Okay? Now, the issue is between, right, the in-between numbers. There's a slight issue with regards to that. Right, so according to the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, that anything that's above 40 until it reaches 60, there's no additional zakat. Right, so 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, right, there's nothing, it's just the musin, that's it. Right, right, 61, 62, no, right, then, right, there's nothing until it reaches the next multiple of either 30 or 40. Right, so if you have 60, right, you give a musin. If you have 61, you still give a musin. You don't give anything extra, according to them, until you reach either 90 or 100, right, because then it's another 30. And that's, the fatwa is on that position, right? The verdict is on that position. However, the Imam's position was that you would give in a kind of a pro-rate amounts on the in-between numbers. So if you have, for instance, 1 extra than 40, then you would give two, a musin, because it's 40, and then 2.5% of another musin, which is 1/40. Right? So, but that's not the, right? And then you would give, right, 5%, 6.7, 10%, and so on. So you give percentage-wise. But the fatwa is on the position of the students, right? That if you have 40 or 60 or anything in between, it's just a musin. There's no in-between numbers. There's no sub-calculations. Tamam. Okay. And just for the notes, the cow that is born, a newborn cow, is called an ijl. And ijl is what's mentioned in the Quran that Bani Israel, they worshipped. Right? It's a calf, and it's from pregnancy, from birth to 1 month. It's a very young. Now, there's one issue, that the person giving the zakat, they can choose either the females or the males. They can give either gender in zakat. So you can give a tabi' or a tabi'ah, feminine, or a musin or a musinnah. Because they don't have to give females as opposed to, for instance, goats. When we get there, you have to give the females. Right, because there is no specific virtue in a female cow, right, as opposed to a male. So the jawamis, the bull, the other types of cows, they're all the same. You can give whatever. They're all considered baqar, right, as a genus. Right, so in regards to cows and sheep, you can give either, right? Because being that the female is not a merit for cows or sheep, as opposed to the camels. Camels, right? We'll see in a moment. When we get to the end, we'll talk about some secondary issues. Regarding the sheep, the minimum amount of sheep you have to have is 40. So if you have 40 sheep, then you would give. And obviously they have to be free grazing for a majority of the year. Right, so if you have between 40 and 120, then you give 1 sheep. If you have 120 to 200, you give 2 sheep. Obviously you can take a sheep out of them and give it, or you can give the monetary value of that sheep. You can 201 to 399 is 3 sheep, 400 is 4 sheep, and then each additional 100 is 1 sheep after that. So 500, 600, 700, just an added sheep. Right, so 500 sheep, 5 sheep you owe. Right? 600 sheep, you owe 6 sheep. 700 sheep, you owe 7 sheep. So after you get to 400, right, each additional 100, there's a sheep. In between, there's nothing. In between, there's nothing. Now, ghanam, the word for sheep here, right? There's a few different words for sheep. There's ghanam and there's shat. Right? So ghanam is the genus, right? It applies to males, females, right? A large amount or a small amount. Right? And they're called ghanam because they are, right? It's the same word as ghanima, which means war spoils, or or something that you can take. And because if you see a sheep, they won't run and they won't defend themselves. So they're pretty much there for the taking. Not that you should do so, but and then we don't have to go into the detail of what the different types are. In the Quran, there's 2 different things that are mentioned: min al-ma'az ithnain wa min al-dha'n ithnain, or I think it's switched actually. Min al-dha'n ithnain, min al-ma'az ithnain. Right? There are different types. So the dha'n is the one that has wool, right? The sheep that have wool, and then the ma'az is the ones that have hair. So they're just, I don't know the specific scientific names for all of them. You can check that in, I believe the Reliance of the Traveler has the names of the different types. Possibly. You can Google it as well. They have all the things there. If you want, you can Right, so a ma'az, that's a male ma'az, right, which is the one with hair, not wool. Right, when it's first born, it's called a sakhla. When it's a little bit older, it's called a jidhyun. And when it's past a year, it's called a tis. And then it becomes a full-blown ma'az. Right, if it's a girl, it's sakhla, then anza, which is mentioned in hadith. Right, and then you have what's called a when it's 1 year or older, it's called a shat. A shat. Right, so here you can understand that you have to give a certain, it has to be at least 1 year old to give that zakat, that goat in zakat. So if you're giving one sheep, it has to be at least a thani, which is one full year old. It's past 1 year old. Right, if it's a dan, the ones that have wool, then if it's a male, it's called a sakhla as well. Then it's called a hamal, then a kharuf, which is also mentioned, right? And then a kabsh, which is mentioned in hadith, in the Quran as well. If it's a female, it's a sakhla, then a jada'ah, right? And then a na'jah, right? Waliya na'jatun wahida, it's in the Quran as well, right? And those, right, anything past a year is also called a shat, as in general. So that's a bit extra. It's not mentioned here in the book. Right, but he does mention at the end, وَالضَّأْنُ وَالْمَعْزُ سَوَاء, whether it's regardless of the type of sheep or goat, right, it counts. They're sawa, they're equal in your payment, and they're equal in calculating your nisab. Right, so if you have a mixture of ma'az and da'an, right, but they add up to 40, you pay zakat on that. Right? So there's no differentiation between the types, only the ages. So they have to be at least 1 year old to pay the zakat. Zakat of horses is a contentious issue, partially because of the meaning of the horse and what it was used for. Similar issue comes in regards to whether the horse is halal to eat or not. Right? So, according to all, it's halal to eat because the meat is not haram, but it's disliked to eat according to some because it's supposed to be used for different means and purposes, and the faras, the horse, has an additional merit over other animals, and just eating it when you have other things to eat is not desirable. Right, so there's a difference of opinion on whether it's even obligatory to give zakat on horses. So the Imam, he said that it's obligatory to give zakat on horses. His students said, no, there's no zakat on horses. Okay. The opinion of the Imam is the most authentic opinion in this regard, as is usually in matters of worship specifically. But the Imam said that there's no specific nisab, there's no amount. That every single horse you give 1 dinar. Every single horse you give either 1 dinar or you give 2.5% of the value of that horse. So you have a choice. Furthermore, there's a slight difference of opinion on the horse itself. If the horse is of Arab lineage, right, or if the horse is of non-Arab lineage. Right, so according to the Imam who says that you have to pay zakat, that if the horse is not of Arab lineage, then the person giving the zakat has the choice of either giving 1 dinar or 2.5%. If it's a non-Arab lineage, right, then there's 2 different opinions. One is that you have to do only 2.5% of the value, and the other one is that you do have a choice. Right, so you can see that there's not much benefit to this difference of opinion. It's unanimous that you can give 2.5% of the value, right, even for a non-Arab horse. And that shows you how important the lineage of horses was to the Arabs. Right? And even till today, there are some horses that are of pure blood that go back to very famous horses of the past, and they're very expensive race horses, and right? And the purebred horses, they go for a lot of money. They're very, very valuable. Right? So 2.5% of a prize horse is a significant benefit to the poor. Just a few side issues before we come to a close. Again, if the animals are not free grazing for majority of the year, right, so that's more than 6 months, right, then there's no zakat at all. Right. Second, with regards to the horses, if you have only male horses or you have only female horses, then according to the most famous opinion, it is not obligatory to give zakat. Because if there's not a mixture of genders, then the wealth is not growing. Because how does wealth grow with regards to animals? Right? Breeding. Right? So if you only have males or you only have females, then you can't have that. Some chose a different opinion because if you only have females, then you can make a contract with somebody who has males, and then, right, and then you get the child. So you can rent a male horse. And these things are done. Right, so majority opinion is that if there's only males, right, then it's not wajib at all. And if there's only females, the most famous opinion is that it's not wajib either. If your horses are merely for carrying things and riding, then there's no zakat at all. If it's for jihad or for work, also no zakat. Now there's a last issue with regards to the imam. At the time when there was a central Muslim leader, right, in the past times, the imam would stipulate a person to go around and collect the zakat. Okay? Now, at the time of Uthman ibn Affan, he regulated it so that the imam can only forcefully take, not forcefully, but like they can compel you to give only your what's called al-amwal al-zahira, your public wealth, but not your private wealth. Before that, it used to be even the imam can compel you to give your private zakat. Right, so what is public wealth and what is private wealth? Private wealth is your money, your gold, your silver, right? In our time, your cash. Right, so at the time of Uthman, the imam can't come into your house and calculate 2.5% of your personal gold and take it. Right, he can't compel you to give your private wealth. That is between you and Allah. But your public wealth, which is the animals that are outside and grazing, right, the imam can come and calculate them and say, you owe this to the government, and if not, then there's a fine or whatever, just like we would have in our times for someone who doesn't pay their taxes. Right, there would be some sort of repercussions. Right, so the imam can take the amwal zahira, the public wealth, which is what's seen by everyone. So that applies to your crops, and that applies to your animals, but not your private wealth, which would be your gold and your silver and your merchandise. But in modern times, there's not much implication to that because it's not often that there's a central Muslim governance. But if there was, then some of these rulings can return. Okay, and then lastly, Imam al-Quduri, he gives some miscellaneous issues. He says that وَمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ نِصَابٌ فَاسْتَفَادَ فِي أَثْنَاءِ الْحَوْلِ مِنْ جِنْسِهِ ضَمَّهُ إِلَيْهِ وَزَكَّاهُ بِهِ. That whoever has the zakatable amount, the nisab, right, and right, so once you have the nisab, the lunar year starts, the time starts. Right? It's not like conveniently every Ramadan you can give your zakat. You scheduled it yourself. No, it becomes obligatory at the anniversary of the time that you entered, right, into the nisab. Right, so it may be different every year, and it may change. Right, so And it's just as obligatory for a person who has wealth to calculate when their nisab starts as it is for a woman to calculate her menstruation. Because both of them have the validity of worships and the fulfillment of the obligations apply to both, necessarily apply to the calculation itself. Tamam. Right, so if you have nisab on January 13th, right, and mid-year in the summer, right, you earned more money. So you had 5,000 at the beginning of the year, and then in June of that year, you earned an extra 20,000. So now you have 25,000, right? When it comes to January 13th of the next year, you pay on everything that was, even that which was profited in the middle of the year. Right, so the only thing that matters is the beginning of the year and the end of the year. If you had nisab at the beginning and you have nisab, right, or more at the end, then you give them whatever the end result is, whatever the final total is at the anniversary date of your nisab. With one exception, if you go below bankruptcy. If you go below 0, then the year finishes. Right, so say January you had 5,000, February you had 6,000, right? March you had 2,000. You went below the nisab, right? And then June 25,000, right? End of the year you had 30,000. Right, so at the end of the year you pay on the 30,000. The fact that you went below the nisab in the middle of the year does not matter. Because in the beginning you had it, at the end you had it, plus more. You give on the end result. The only exception is if mid-year you go below 0. You go to 0. If you have 0 wealth in the middle of the year, then the year finishes. The year is void. And if you ever get back to the nisab again, then the year will start from brand new. Tamam. He mentions here, right, so and the reason why he mentions that, because in the Shafi'i madhab, every new additional wealth that enters into your possession, right, then the year applies to that wealth too. Right, so say you have money that you made from inheritance. You have other money that you made from work. Right, then you had another money because you made a business transaction. Right, so you have 3 sets of money. Each set would have its own year. Right, so, and because it's a bit complicated to calculate that, I mean, you could do it, right, and it can be done to calculate that, especially if you don't have like a radical business portfolio, right, where things are just coming in and out. If it's a pretty steady, you only have one income, it's quite doable to calculate, but in the Hanafi madhab, right, that calculation doesn't apply. So that's why he's mentioning it here as a clarification, right? That ruling of another school does not apply. Right, so whatever profits you made in the beginning, or in the middle of the year, is added to that category, right? And zakat is paid at the anniversary of whatever is present. Right, so somebody asked, right, you have $5,000 January 1st, right? And then December 31st of the following year, the day before you're supposed to pay your zakat, right? Somebody gave you $2 million. Right? So you have $2 million plus 5,000, right? So what do you pay zakat on? You pay zakat on $2 million, right? $5,000. Right? Just be grateful you got the $2 million. Don't feel sad about the 2.5%. Because if you have 2 million, 2.5% won't hurt you. But it will extremely help the poor. Right? And it will, again, like we said before, it will remove that excessive disenfranchisement of the poor, right? And it will facilitate people, right, who tend to be, because of our current structure, stuck at 0, right, and unable to re-engage in the social market. Right, so it helps everyone. It benefits everyone. Right, and it's not a tax, it's an act of worship. It's an act of worship. You are drawing nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by paying the zakat. It is to your benefit. Okay, and then lastly, he says, advanced zakat is permissible. All right, sorry, we skipped one. He says, there's a small issue in the beginning, in the middle here. He says, وَالسَّائِمَةُ هِيَ الَّتِي تَكْفِي بِالرَّعْيِ فِي أَكْثَرِ حَوْلِهَا فَإِنْ عَلَفَهَا نِصْفَ الْحَوْلِ أَوْ أَكْثَرَ فَلَا زَكَاةَ فِيهَا. The grazing camel, the cattle, right, are those who graze for majority of the year. Right, those who suffice by merely grazing for the majority of the year. Right, so they would live if you just let them graze. You don't have to pay, right, for majority of the year at least. Right? If you fed them for half the year or more, then there's no zakat due on them. Again, it would be unduly difficult that you're spending your money for them for them, and then you have to pay on them. Right. Then he says, وَالزَّكَاةُ عِنْدَ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ وَأَبِي يُوسُفَ فِي النِّصَابِ دُونَ الْعَفْوِ. Zakat, according to Abu Hanifa and Imam Abu Yusuf, is in the nisab, not that which is extra. Right? Not that which is extra. Right? Again, this is like we mentioned before. Like for instance, there's 40 goats, right? 41 is just extra. Right? 41 is just extra. Right? Same thing. You have 120. If you have 400 sheep, you owe 4 sheep. Right? If you have 401, that's the extra. There's no zakat applies to the extra. It's between the two levels. Right? Once you reach the next level, then the next level zakat is due. So once you get to 500, then an additional goat. Right? It's not that you get 401, you give four goats and then 1% of another goat. No. Right? And that does not apply according to Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Abu Yusuf. وَقَالَ مُحَمَّدٌ تَجِبُ فِيهَا. That Imam Muhammad says, تَجِبُ فِيهِمَا, that it applies to both. That if you had 401, you would give 1% of an additional goat. Right? So you would give a prorated kind of expense, but that's not the relied upon position. The relied position is the opinion of the Imam of the school, Imam Abu Hanifa, that it's only in the actual levels, not in the gray areas between. And then lastly he says, وَإِذَا هَلَكَ الْمَالُ بَعْدَ وُجُوبِ الزَّكَاةِ سَقَطَ. If all a person's wealth is destroyed after zakat became obligatory on them, right, then the obligation falls off. So when would zakat become obligatory on them? At the anniversary date of when they entered nisab. So January 1st, you had 5,000. You start your calculation. January 1st of the next year, it's obligatory on you to give zakat, preferably right away. Preferably right away. Delaying is disliked, right? Unless there's an excuse or a necessity involved. But say January 2nd, all of the wealth was destroyed, stock market crash or whatever happened, all of the wealth is destroyed. May Allah make it easy for us and save us. Then even though it was obligatory on you, you don't have to make qada. Right? It falls off. The zakat falls off. Now, if it became obligatory on you and the wealth wasn't destroyed, you just didn't pay it, right? Then you owe that. If the next year, right, the next lunar year continues, right, then that's a second obligation. So you have to pay twice, and then 3 times, and then 4 times. Right? Right, so zakat is made up. Right? It is made up. So if someone wants to make tawbah for their zakat, it's not that like, okay, from now on I'm going to pay. That's where you start. But slowly, one should try to calculate what was in the past. Right? Reasonable surety that I definitely had nisab, right, from this year to this year. So that would be one time I should pay. Right? How much did I had at the end of the year? And you can calculate. Usually people have some record. Right? And you can pay for previous years, right? Excluding any debts that you had at that time. Right? But obviously the ideal is to start paying from now on, right? But then to look back and try to rectify as best as one can, right? By reasonable surety, trying to estimate, right? And then seeing that as you're as a way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah accepts those who, right? The more that we try to rectify our states with Allah and rectify what has gone past, the closer we get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not an all or nothing thing, that if I don't make up all my zakat, then Allah is not going to love me. No. Right? The more you do for Allah, the more Allah will love you and facilitate for you. And you'll see the barakah in your wealth pouring in. The last issue he mentions is about advanced zakat. Can you pay ahead of time? Right, so he says, وَإِن قَدَّمَ الزَّكَاةَ عَلَى الْحَوْلِ وَهُوَ مَالِكٌ لِلنِّصَابِ جَازَ. Right, if a person pays zakat ahead, in advance of the year, the hawl, the lunar year finishing, right, with the condition that they already attained, they have nisab, then it's permissible. Right, so if you don't have nisab, right, then zakat is not obligatory on you. Right, so it's not that, okay, today I have $2,000. I don't have nisab. I'm 3,000 short. Right? But I'm going to pay in advance for this year, because later in the year I might be, I will have 5,000. Right? No. Right? You can only pay in advance after you already have nisab. So once you get 5,000, you can, right, instead of waiting the entire year, you can pay ahead of time. Now, if you pay ahead of time, then at the end of the year, right, unless you made the exact estimation of how much you would have at the end of the year and you paid 2.5% of that, right, then you have to just act accordingly. If you gave too little, then you would just give the extra at the end of the year. Right, so say you assumed that 2.5% at the end of the year, I would probably owe $200. Right, most likely my total amount at the end of the year will be such and such, and I owe $200. So you give $200. But then you realize at the end of the year, your total amount was more than you expected, right? And you should have paid $250. So take $50, give it to a poor person. Right? And that completes your zakat. If you gave too much in advance, so say you assumed that at the end of the year you would have to owe 200 or 300, so you gave 300. But at the end of the year, you realize you only had to pay 200. Do you get reimbursement for advanced zakat? No. Right? That extra $100 that you paid is counted for you as voluntary charity. And you will find it with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment. And there you will be recompensed to the fullest extent. وَمَا تُقَدِّمُوا لِأَنفُسِكُم مِّنْ خَيْرٍ تَجِدُوهُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. Whatever good that you send forth for yourselves, you will find it with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. هُوَ خَيْرٌ وَأَعْظَمَ أَجْرًا. He is better for you, and He is more tremendous in giving rewards. That's all for today. Tomorrow we'll do next week we'll do the most important part of zakat, which is the most practical all around the world, which is the zakat of silver and gold, which is where we directly relate that to cash, right, to money itself, and naqdain. Right, and then after that we will be discussing merchandise. Right, so if you're a business person and you're selling something, the value of your commodities is also zakatable. And then there's secondary issues with regards to, like, for instance, stocks and real estate, right, different ownerships that you have. وصلى الله وبارك وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين. If there's any questions, we can take a couple, inshallah.